good morning, everybody. And I just want to really welcome you, Justin, and thank you so much for agreeing to contribute to Inclusion Dialogue. Your name was suggested to me by the wonderful Lani Florian, and thankfully you've agreed to participate in this series. Really interested in hearing what you have to say, and in particular, I start all of my interviews by asking contributors just to maybe describe their early career and how they entered and kind of became passionate about the field of inclusive and special education. So would you mind just starting, maybe just giving us an insight into how you kind of came into this field?
Sure, Joanne. Thank you so much for having me. I have to go back pretty far into my biography to explain my interest in inclusive education and special education and its development. My twin brother was one of the first mainstream students in Virginia schools in Charlottesville, Virginia in the 70s. The schools had just been desegregated racially, but there was a battle to be had about the integration and mainstreaming, as we called it then, of children with disabilities. And we had a federally funded lawyer to fight the school district to get access to the public schools. We succeeded after 2 years, and a ramp was built. My brother's a wheelchair user, and so Martin was able to then also benefit from public schooling. And so from a very early age, I've been very aware of questions of access and inclusion and disability. And yeah, that's basically put me on the path.
Your inspiration, I suppose.
Yes, my inspiration. Yeah. And unfortunately, we were never able to spend a school day together because they made a different school accessible than the one in our neighborhood. So I also have, that was a very important lesson in the power of institutions. And yeah, so
in impacting your day-to-day and just that kind of normal, I suppose, normal family interactions that you might have had. Yeah.
And then when I got to college, I read in my first sociology anthropology course, I read Irving Goffman's book Stigma, and realized, I've been doing this my whole life, observing and understanding the power of what people think of others and labels and all the work we do to appear in public and in social life. So and then I read a few years later, I found Sally Tomlinson's Sociology of Special Education when I was writing my BA thesis on mainstreaming, and that just put me on the path to really try to connect a sociology of disability and special education. And yeah.
Can you remember, and can I ask, like, what was it in her work that truly engaged you? Like what kind of sparked the interest from her own studies?
Yeah, I so influential, and actually we're now very good friends. Sally was inspirational in really uncovering all the taken for granted aspects of special education, and that was. And I then thought, well, my contribution could be to take a similar approach, but then do it comparatively across countries, because my mother is from Eastern Germany, and I grew up in a bilingual and bicultural household, and so I always had this affinity for Germany, for Europe, and I thought, well, sociology of special education could be done also cross-culturally, and so that's where I've put my emphasis in my career.
And would it be fair to say that hadn't been done at that point, that it wasn't a very developed field, that comparative piece?
Well, actually, there were others who were beginning to do that kind of comparative study, but not in a very systematic way, and so yeah. And then there was the other piece was in college I met Adrienne Ash, who was a very important ethicist about disability and disability rights activist, and she put me in contact with Irv Zola, who was the founder of Disability Studies Quarterly,
Okay.
So even very early on, even before I even thought about graduate school, I had already had these kind of contacts to people who were very inspirational and influential in the field, and they were incredibly welcoming and really helped me to understand some of the fundamental issues that were at stake in this field, and then trying to combine disability studies with comparative, inclusive, and special education research became sort of my raison d'etre.
Yeah. And you did your graduate studies in the United States, right?
And then I actually moved to Germany and I started a MA program at the University of North Carolina, then moved to the Humboldt University in Berlin. And since then, this is more than 20 years now, I've been in the German-speaking world. So it's also, this has been very important for me to understand how education systems develop, and also their tremendous differences. And it took me many years as I began my doctoral work at the Max Planck Institute for Education Research in Berlin to fully realize the extent of segregation that was still prevalent and is unfortunately even today still very prevalent in Germany and throughout many parts of Europe. So I simply didn't want to believe the numbers that I saw and the reality that there was in schooling, that it's still so segregated, and I thought this didn't fit to a democracy. And
and it's quite kind of culturally, would you say, embedded in the systems there and accepted?
Well, that's the work that I've been doing on trying to understand the development of special and inclusive education has really pointed out that choices made even 100 years ago, there was Germany and the United States took very different pathways to institutionalize special education. The US, of course, is more about special classes in schools, and in Germany, based on their general education system, is very much about having a special school form or a special school type for each group. And so this was also done in special education. There are very few countries that have as many different special school types as Germany. So that's for in that system, that's quite legitimate to have that differentiation in the educational system.
And for our listeners that aren't familiar with the German system, and we haven't really had a German contributor to the podcast before, could you just give a very brief overview before we get to your findings and what you've actually explored and found? But what does that kind of special education system look like for a young person, and when does kind of, I suppose, differentiation or tracking or streaming or whatever take place?
Yes, that's also one of the major sources of inequality in the German education system, that they often have a very early branching point in your educational career after grade 4, grade 6, and special schooling there's a one-way street. So once you are sent to a special school, it's very unlikely that you'll come back to general education. And that kind of differentiation in secondary schooling is then there's further differentiation in the special schools. So it's a very early tracking, and there's not much permeability in the system. So this is also one of the things that is emphasized in the German-American comparison, is that you really see that having at least all pupils in one school building makes it much more flexible, and you have permeability between the tracks, and that's a huge advantage. If you are really spatially segregated, it's very, very difficult. Of course, that's antithetical to inclusion and simply not possible.
And can I ask, you mentioned there the American-German comparison, and that has been really the emphasis of your work. So what are the key kind of findings that it's a long career we're talking about, but what have you found when doing those comparisons and that comparative work? What has it produced over the years?
In my book, Barriers to Inclusion, Special Education in the US and Germany, I emphasized that the long-term institutionalization of the educational system and of difference between general and special education has been the main barrier to in inclusive education because of the taken for grantedness of having special education, be either resource rooms or special classes, or in the German case, having special schools. So teacher training is oriented to those different school forms, and policymakers and everyone who's been through the educational system has taken that on as being the way it is. So I originally didn't think I was going to work historically, but I found through my early research that actually we really need to look at these institutionalization processes over the very long term. That the way that ideas and norms and policies develop over time they're so embedded in the culture and so difficult to change. And of course, the German-speaking countries are all very challenged by the UNCRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, because that calls for an inclusive education system from, throughout the life course, and that simply is antithetical, requires a tremendous, full system transformation to realize. So that's also why we've seen that only in some areas of Germany has inclusive education really been implemented, and in other areas there's actually been a backlash where we've actually had increasing segregation rates.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So it's obviously the system isn't centralized; it's devolved in some way. So
right, and that's actually one of the main reasons why the German American comparisons are fascinating, but also challenging, because of course federal systems, there you have a tremendous diversity within those countries. This is also the case. I've done work on Switzerland and Austria, that many countries that have federal control over education. You have some pioneers, some innovators, and then you have some other regions or states that are not changing. So that's on. I wish that policymakers would use that more as a laboratory for change and really try to follow the best practices or good practices, inspiring practices that certain regions have found, but that's unfortunately not usually done.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. In your work, have you ever been able to, you mentioned that legacy piece on history guiding current practice, and for those regions that are innovative and that are perhaps adopting more inclusive practices, what are the factors do you think that are shaping that? And is there a legacy piece, a more local legacy piece going on there?
Well, certainly this is one of the main challenges we face in inclusive education research, that is to be policy relevant. It's always multi-level, multi-dimensional, and we need to look at all the different levels where change would need to occur. And it's I think what we've found out from the potential, but also perhaps the limits of instruments like the UNCRPD or human rights approach to inclusive education is top-down. It cannot only be a top-down process, and we have to really think about valorizing what can be done at the local level. And of course, there are inclusive practices in every school, and we need to identify how we get to those, and then encourage others to follow that path and to be teaching in that way. And so that's another piece of the work that I've been doing, is more cross-cultural and really looking at different countries and different contexts, but at the school level where we see huge advances in the way that we teach, the way that we valorize diversity, the way we can support all learners. And that's a very positive message. it's sort of in between. We have we have on the global level the development of human rights approach and that understanding, the global norm of inclusive education becoming ever stronger. And at the local level, we have many examples of excellent practice, excellent meaning also equitable and inclusive. But it's at the meso level of and the macro level of school systems, of the state level, where it's been very difficult to really have a fundamental shift toward inclusive education. So I think in one of the major messages that, or what I have found in my research is, we really also need to connect and think about the relationship of special and inclusive education in different contexts. That's always difficult, because it means we have to do think about the potential for change is incremental mainly, and there are very few instances where we simply start from scratch. And so we need to think about the what special education, how it's developed, and how that can be used and to facilitate inclusive education. But this relationship, of course, is highly ambivalent and conflictual even, and so that's also one of the reasons why the change we see is relatively limited in many contexts, because it is a battle on many levels to even understand how that relationship should be, and how we can best use what we've learned from special education and the special education supports that are there to facilitate inclusive education in all schools. And so the resources in Germany are mainly in those special schools. So it's really about shifting resources and also the pedagogical competence into all schools, and that means a complete transformation of your educational system.
It does, and it's root and branch stuff that you're talking about, right? And I think in the over the series of the podcasts, there's a couple of things that keep coming up, and I'm just interested to maybe hear your perspectives, given that you have insights into these kind of, the German context and the US context. But the first one is initial teacher education. Like, funding comes up quite regularly. School leadership comes up quite regularly. And it's like what you're talking about there. It's that relationship between special and inclusion, how one can inform the other. Have you got any insights into maybe those themes that I've raised, or other themes that you think are important?
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to imagine inclusive education being realized throughout the educational system without reforming teacher training, teacher education. And that is an essential part of what needs to happen. And that also means change of institutions at the tertiary level that are, we also have a challenge in teaching inclusively in higher education. So that would actually need to be a model for in our teacher education programs. We should be much more attuned to universal design for learning and being open, having an open classroom. And that's, of course, very difficult in a meritocratic organizational form like the university to be open and so that makes it more challenging to then say, well, the teachers we're training should be working inclusively, but we don't do it ourselves. So that's why in many of the work in the analyses that I've done, it's about looking at holistically at the educational system and to see these interlinkages between levels, and to be truly inclusive, we really need to think about change at all these different levels, and one would inform the other. Well, we've got big challenges ahead.
Yeah, and it's so true, because I think from a research perspective, often people focus on sectors separately, but they're not separate, they're intimately connected, right? So, but yeah, a little bit like what you're saying about the different settings in the German context, the sectors often don't speak to one another either, and in research capacity as well. Justin, is there any work that you would like to discuss or, like describe to our readers before I let you get back to your busy day, no doubt? But is there any particular pieces of work that you'd like to maybe allow readers to, or listeners to read and follow up on?
Sure. We've been working for several years in a network on inclusive education research focused on comparative international perspectives in the German-speaking countries, those being Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, where I've been based for the last 10 years. And it's been very, very interesting to collect studies of different countries around the world in this network, and to really try to map the field of comparative education, looking at inclusive education. And we published an international handbook of inclusive education, open access for in a German English bilingual volume.
Brilliant.
And I think one of the major messages is we also need to think about translating our results into different languages to really be aware of developments in other cultural contexts and other languages. And I think that's where I see tremendous potential for advancing the research agenda beyond just we're often in a particular language or a particular context where we're very much stuck in a particular way of thinking about education, and the comparative approach can really help to broaden the conversation and to see the common challenges, but also differences. And we would like to encourage policymakers to make good decisions. And if we can use comparative education research results for that purpose, I think that should be our goal.
And do you think that the conversations, like even down to the barrier of language, that the conversations have been happening in silos to some extent?
Well, yes, and it is also as an American, much of the research literature that I read is often the context is not even explicitly mentioned. It's assumed that this is the universal, that what we and that's I think a benefit of being in Europe, that in a region with so many different cultures and so many different languages and systems, you're always in a comparative mode, or often in a comparative mode, and that's very, very helpful to understand that there are so many ways we could organize, and so many different ways we can reform education, and that we need to see that as a tremendous potential and get beyond our own system, and also, of course, the comparative method is excellent in understanding better our own system through looking at others, and also what we take for granted, what we don't understand about our system, because that's how it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I thought that was my last question, but I now have another one. Methodologically, how do you see the area of research in inclusive, but also in special education, and in particular the handbook you just mentioned? So what kind of types of methodologies do you think are predominantly used and should be used?
Well, that's the great thing about this field is that it is highly diverse, and we see methods from discourse analysis, document analysis, to expert interviews, to ethnographic methods, participant observation, and also very important is there's really innovative work on emancipatory research, participatory research with people with disabilities. And I think that's hugely important for this field, not to research about others, but engage in everyone in that research process. So there's tremendous diversity of methodologies that are used. And I think theoretically, we also need to advance the agenda, and that global conversation can really help in that regard, because there are certain theoretical strands that are dominant in different cultural arenas that it would benefit if we brought those conversations together. And we had a panel at the European Educational Research Association double symposium, and that was very, very helpful to look to see what diversity of work is being done in Europe on education.
And funding's linked to that, right? Like research funding and the types of methodologies that are promoted by people who fund, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Justin, that was really great conversation. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything that I've overlooked or perhaps haven't encouraged you to talk about that you'd like to?
I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about inclusive education research. And I think the podcast is great resource.
Well, thank you for contributing to it. Thanks a lot, Justin. Take care.